Delaney Mercer had climbed 3 steps toward the entrance of the Ferraro Hotel when a hand came up and stopped her. "Don't move! Who do you think you are, using this door?" Camille Ashford stood between her and the glass, black evening gown, nails the color of dark wine, the golden chandelier light and the string quartet spilling out behind her. Delaney lifted the red-tagged cooler bag. "I'm delivering medication for Mrs. Ferraro. The hospital asked me to bring it tonight." Camille never looked at the bag. She looked at the faded blue scrubs, the sleeves worn to threads, the nursing shoes coming apart at the sole after a 16-hour shift. Then she said it loud enough that the whole line of guests near the door turned around. "You filthy, ragged thing. Get away from here. You don't belong here, and you never will." Delaney only said quietly that she would leave the medication at the front desk and go, and stepped aside to pass. That was when the hand shoved her shoulder. Not hard, just a push, the way a person moves a chair out of the way. But her sole was loose, and the granite was slick with rain. She went down, sliding the length of all 3 steps to the sidewalk. The cooler bag sprang open. 4 glass vials rolled out, each turn ringing thinly against the stone, through a puddle, coming to rest at the mouth of the storm drain. Behind the glass, nearly 200 people turned to watch physicians, attorneys, 3 board members who had personally approved the payroll at the hospital where she worked. Not one of them pushed open the door. Delaney crawled on her knees along the wet pavement, picking up each vial, wiping it on her shirt, checking the seal, checking the temperature strip on the label, still good. She did it with the calm of someone who had done it 1,000 times, except this time the rain was running down the back of her collar. Inside, exactly 6 steps from the glass, a man in a charcoal 3-piece suit watched all of it. Cassius Ferraro saw the shove. He saw the vials roll toward the drain. He saw a woman in blue kneeling on the sidewalk outside a hotel that carried his family's name. He raised his glass, turned away, and went back to the conversation he'd been having. Delaney picked up the last vial and stood, without brushing off her clothes, without wiping her face, without looking at Camille for even a second. She set the bag on the top step, told the doorman standing frozen there that all 4 vials were intact and needed to stay cold, then turned and walked out through the rain with her back straight as a post. There's a kind of wound that doesn't come from the fall. It comes from going down in front of 200 people, and not one of them steps forward. If you've ever given away the most precious thing you had and been forgotten by life itself, this story is for you. Because that night, the woman called a filthy, ragged thing on those steps was the same woman who had saved the life of Cassius Ferraro's mother 7 years earlier, and of the 200 people behind that glass, not a single one knew it. Only she did. She had known for 7 years, and she had chosen to say nothing. If you'd like to hear the rest of this story, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to follow the stories still to come. On the top floor of the Ferraro building, rain struck the thick glass as though someone were hurling handful after handful of gravel against the windows, while the city below spread out in a blurred lattice of yellow lights beneath the water. Cassius Ferraro had taken off his suit jacket, draped it over the back of a chair, and seated himself behind the walnut desk where his father had sat for 30 years. He didn't turn on the ceiling lights. There was only a desk lamp casting a small circle of light across the wood, and within that circle lay an unopened ivory envelope. The door opened. 2 men escorted in a third, and that third man was Merrick Doyle, the night shift manager at Dock Number 4 in the East Harbor. He was in his 50s, wearing a raincoat that was still wet, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his hands seemed to have nowhere to rest, so they kept closing and opening, closing and opening. No one touched him. No one needed to. Cassius pointed to the chair across from him, and Doyle sat down like a man lowering himself onto the edge of a hospital bed. 3 shipments, Cassius said. His voice was no louder than the rain. September, November, January. Each one was missing 7% of its declared weight. It wasn't a scale error. Scale errors go both ways. Doyle opened his mouth. Cassius raised one finger, and the man closed it again. "I didn't invite you up here to hear an explanation," Cassius continued. "I invited you because I already know. You've worked at that harbor for 15 years. My father gave you the night shift when your wife was sick, so you could earn the extra allowance. You remember that, don't you?" Doyle nodded. He couldn't speak. Cassius opened the drawer on his right, took out a key, and placed it on the desk, directly in the center of the lamplight. It was an old key, its brass gone dull, with a small piece of blue plastic tied to the end with twine. Doyle looked at it, and it seemed as though every trace of air had been pulled from his body. "The house on Halloran Street," Cassius said. 3 bedrooms, a gray tile roof, a wooden fence you repaint every spring. You're 4 payments behind. The bank placed it on the liquidation list before Thanksgiving. This afternoon, I bought the debt. Not the house. The debt. Rain lashed the glass in one long burst. Doyle looked at the key, then lifted his eyes, and in them was something Cassius had seen hundreds of times in this room, something that had stopped interesting him long ago. "You can ask for it back," Cassius said. "Or you can tell me who paid you. I don't care which one you choose, but I want you to understand that both choices are sitting on this desk, and both of them belong to you." Doyle remained silent for a very long time. Then he spoke a name, and his voice broke in the middle of it. The Vasco family. The contact was a man named Ruskin. They had paid him in cash 3 times, in the parking lot behind a diner on Bellwood Street. When he finished, he lowered his head, placed both hands on his knees, and remained that way. Cassius wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. He pushed the key across the desk toward Doyle. "Take it." Doyle looked up, not understanding. "I don't need your house," Cassius said. "I need you to remember that I can take it whenever I choose." Doyle picked up the key with both hands, the way a person might hold something hot. He started to say something, perhaps thank you, but Cassius had already turned his chair toward the window, and that was the end of it. The 2 men led Doyle out. The door closed very softly. That was how the Ferraro family conducted its business, and it had been that way since his grandfather's time. No one was beaten. No one ended up in a hospital. People simply woke one morning and discovered that everything they stood upon belonged to someone else. His father had told him, when Cassius was 19 years old, in this very room, that fists created enemies, while documents created servants. Cassius had never needed to test the truth of those words. Ambrose Teague entered without knocking, because he was the only man in the building who didn't have to. He limped across the carpet, his black cane touching the floor once every 3 steps, and stopped at the edge of the lamp's circle of light. He was an aging man who had served 3 generations of masters in this family, and in all those many decades, he had never stood in that place wearing the expression he wore tonight. "Sir," he said, "about the woman on the steps." Cassius continued looking out the window. Below them, rainwater was running like rivers along the gutters, carrying trash and fallen leaves toward the storm drains. "It isn't our concern," he said. Ambrose remained there a little longer. He meant to continue. He had prepared the next sentence during the entire journey upstairs, and that sentence was, "Sir, I believe it concerns us far more than you realize." But he didn't say it. He looked at the back of the young man sitting in the darkness, looked at the unopened ivory envelope resting on the desk, and thought of another envelope, much older, lying inside the safe in the basement, sealed with red wax that had hardened 7 years ago. Then he bowed his head, turned away, and left. His black cane touched the floor once every 3 steps, growing fainter and fainter, until nothing remained but the sound of the rain. The Ashford estate stood on the western hillside, 18 miles from the harbor district and a distance from Delaney Mercer's world that couldn't be measured in miles. Royce Hadley arrived in the middle of the following morning. His car stopped at the far end of the white gravel drive, and he walked the rest of the way because no one had told him he was permitted to park any closer. He was a middle-aged man, the director of human resources at St. Bellamy Hospital, wearing a shirt with a stiffly starched collar and a tie knotted a little too tightly. A housekeeper led him to the conservatory behind the mansion, where Camille Ashford was trimming several stems of moth orchids with a small pair of silver scissors. She didn't turn around when he entered. "You know why I called you, don't you?" Hadley said he wasn't sure. Camille clipped away a withered stem, placed it on the white enamel tray beside her, and only then turned to face him. She was dressed casually, her hair tied low, with no makeup on, and that was precisely what made her look even more frightening than she had the night before. "Your contract with the hospital board expires in March," she said. "Another 3 years if it's renewed. I hear your daughter has just received an acceptance letter from Georgetown Law School. Tuition there is very expensive these days, isn't it?" Hadley didn't answer. "I'm merely mentioning it," Camille said, turning back to the orchids. "I believe you're a man who knows how to look ahead. I believe you'll find a suitable reason on your own." There was no threat. There wasn't a single sentence that, if recorded, could have been taken into a courtroom. Hadley walked back down the white gravel drive to his car, sat inside it for 10 minutes without starting the engine, then drove back to the hospital and did exactly what he understood he was expected to do. He opened the archive containing the supply distribution logs for the MM unit, printed the most recent 3 months, and stayed after office hours with a ballpoint pen and a stack of blank paper. He wasn't a professional, but he didn't need to be. He only needed a report thick enough that no one on the board would want to read it all the way through, and a signature at the bottom that, at first glance, resembled the night nurse's handwriting. He practiced the letters D and M 9 times on a scrap sheet before he was satisfied. The report was 11 pages long. It concluded that during the previous quarter, there had been a discrepancy between the quantity of supplies released from storage and the quantity recorded as used in the MM unit, that the night shift distribution logs showed signs of entries being added after the actual time of use, and that the person directly responsible throughout that entire period was Nurse Delaney Mercer. He sent it on Thursday afternoon. On Friday, Delaney received an email informing her that she had been suspended without pay while she was restocking the medication cart in the 3rd-floor hallway. She read it on her phone, read it a second time, then slipped the phone into her pocket and finished her shift because 4 patients still needed their intravenous fluids changed, and there was no one else who could do it. On Monday, the state nursing board sent formal notice that her license had been suspended pending an investigation. There was no date for when the investigation would end. There was no one to call. There was only an automated number and a voicemail box that was already full. The 6 days that followed became 6 closed doors. Marchetti Hospital on the north side called back after 4 hours and said the position had been filled. Fairholme Nursing Center scheduled an interview, then canceled it the evening before. A private clinic on Vandermeer Street accepted her application, kept it for 3 days, then mailed it back without a single written word. At the 4th place, a woman in human resources looked at her across the reception desk and said softly, almost with pity, that she should try another city. The 5th place didn't offer her an interview. At the 6th, a small nursing home on the outskirts of the city, the administrator carried her application all the way into the parking lot, returned it to her by hand, and said he was very sorry, that he believed her, but that the entire city's medical hiring system operated through a single platform, and that platform belonged to Ashford Holdings. When he finished speaking, he turned and went back inside, leaving Delaney standing in the parking lot with the application folder in her hands, finally understanding that she wasn't being rejected by 6 different places. She was being rejected by one place, 6 times. On the 7th day, she returned to the boarding house on Corbin Street and found her belongings waiting in the hallway. 3 cardboard boxes and a cloth suitcase had been arranged neatly against the wall. Nothing had been thrown. Nothing had been scattered carelessly. The landlady, a woman in her 60s named Wanda, who for the past 2 years had always saved Delaney a box of pastries during every holiday, stood in the doorway with a ring of keys in her hand. She wouldn't look Delaney in the eyes. She looked down at the doorknob, then toward the window at the far end of the hallway, and said she was sorry, that someone had called, that she still had to live. Delaney didn't ask who had called. She didn't need to ask anymore. She thanked Wanda for the past 2 years, and she meant it, then bent down, stacked the 3 boxes one on top of another, tucked the suitcase beneath her arm, and walked down the stairs. Wanda remained standing there until the sound of Delaney's footsteps had completely faded on the floor below. Only then did she close the door, and she wept on the other side of it. But that was something Delaney would never know. The Corbin Street bus station had a row of orange plastic seats bolted to the concrete floor, and Delaney sat in the 4th seat from the end, with 3 cardboard boxes stacked beneath her feet and the cloth suitcase resting across her knees. Rain swept beneath the metal roof whenever the wind rose. She slipped a hand into the breast pocket of her nursing uniform, where she had kept something for more than 2 weeks, and took it out. The paper had been folded into quarters, its edges were worn, and now it was wet. The crayon hadn't smudged, but the pencil lines around it had bled into faint gray streaks like mist. She opened it very slowly, afraid it might tear, and studied the drawing beneath the fluorescent lights of the bus station. There was a girl in a blue shirt holding a bunch of 7 balloons, each one a different color, and beside her was a much smaller boy running, his legs drawn as 2 straight lines, slanting backward to show that he was moving very fast. Across the top, written in uneven red crayon with 1 letter missing, were the words Miss Laney and Toby. The 7-year-old boy had spent nearly 4 months in the MM unit, and during those 4 months, Delaney had worked the night shift 18 times. On every one of those 18 nights, she had stopped by his room before beginning her shift and told him a short story about some bird she had seen on her way to work, even on the days when she had to invent the bird. Then he got better. It happened slowly, and then all at once, the way children so often recover. On the morning he was discharged, the entire unit stood in the hallway, and Toby ran down that hallway holding the drawing high above his head. He ran straight to her, smiling the wide smile of a child whose 2 front teeth hadn't grown back yet. He pushed the paper into her hand and told her he had spent 2 whole evenings drawing it. Then he asked her something. He said his birthday was at the end of the month, at his grandmother's house, where there would be cake and a very large backyard. And he asked whether she would come. Delaney crouched down until she was level with his eyes, and she told him she would. She said definitely. She said she would bring real balloons, more than 7 of them. Toby said that in that case, he would save her the piece of cake with the most frosting, and then he ran away, while his mother turned to wave from the far end of the hallway before the elevator doors closed. 3 days later, the email arrived while Delaney was restocking the medication cart on the 3rd floor. Delaney folded the paper along the same 4 old creases, carefully, slipped it back into her breast pocket, then pressed her palm against the fabric to help dry it. Toby's birthday had passed at the end of the previous month. She hadn't gone. She hadn't called. She hadn't sent a single message, because she didn't know what she could write to a 7-year-old boy to explain that people had just called her a thief, and that she didn't want her name appearing inside that house with the very large backyard on a day that was meant to be happy. It was the first promise she had ever broken in all her years as a nurse, and as she sat on that orange plastic seat, surrounded by the rain tapping against the metal roof and the loudspeaker announcing the final bus of the day, she realized that of everything they had taken from her over the past 6 days, the thing that hurt the most wasn't her nursing license, or her room, or even her name. It was the piece of cake with the most frosting that a child had saved for her, and she hadn't come to claim it. The public legal aid office was on the 2nd floor of an old government building on Fallon Street, and visitors had to take a number at the counter downstairs before waiting on a row of wooden benches worn smooth where generations of people had sat. Delaney waited for nearly the entire morning, with her 3 cardboard boxes temporarily left in the security office. The lawyer's name was Bernard Otley. He was in his 60s, wearing a gray sweater with a small hole at one elbow, and his desk was piled so high with case files that he had to lean sideways to see the person seated across from him. He read the 11-page report very slowly, turning each sheet with the tips of his fingers, saying nothing for so long that Delaney began to hear the clock ticking on the hallway wall. Then he stopped at the final page, where the signature appeared, and raised it closer to his eyes. "This isn't your handwriting." Delaney said it wasn't. Otley nodded, set the page down, removed his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I've been doing this for 22 years, he said. "I'm not going to lie to make you feel better when you walk out that door. You'll win. A forged signature is a forged signature. A handwriting examination will prove it, and any board will have to restore your license." He put his glasses back on. "The problem is time. The other side is Ashford Holdings. They won't argue with you about the signature. They'll argue jurisdiction, procedure, whether the matter belongs before the state board or a civil court, and every time they do, it adds another 4 to 6 months. They have an entire floor of salaried lawyers, and to them, each filing is only an afternoon's work. To you, each filing means another day you have to take off, assuming you still have a job to take leave from." He rested both elbows on the desk. 4 years. Maybe 3 if you're lucky. That's the honest number. Delaney remained still. Otley looked at her, and what he said next wasn't the question of a lawyer, but of a man who had spent too many years in that room and had watched too many people sit in the chair across from him. "I'm going to ask you something, and I'm not asking to make this harder. What will you live on during those 4 years?" She couldn't answer. Otley didn't wait for one. He wrote his phone number on a small sticky note, handed it to her, and said that if she found a way to survive those 4 years, she should call him, and he would take the case for free. She thanked him, and she left the building with the note in her pocket, knowing she would never call. That night, she slept in the laundromat at the corner of Corbin Street and Palmer Street, a place that stayed open all night and had 4 plastic chairs lined against the wall, where no one forced anyone to leave as long as they kept feeding coins into the machines. She washed the 2 sets of nursing scrubs she would never again wear anywhere, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. The dryer turned in a slow, steady circle, giving off a low humming sound that she found strangely comforting. Before dawn, while the darkness still pressed against the windows and the street outside remained black and glossy from the rain of the previous days, she took out the form the state nursing board had enclosed in a second envelope. It was a voluntary permanent surrender of her right to practice. If she signed it, the investigation would end immediately. The file would be closed. There would be no finding of misconduct, and no negative notation would appear in the federal system. The final line stated that this was the practitioner's own choice. She placed the form on top of the washing machine, smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and picked up a pen. The tip touched the paper inside the signature box. Then her hand began to shake. It wasn't shaking from the cold. It shook in a way she had never seen in herself before. The trembling of someone who had held a needle steady for 7 years and now couldn't hold a $3 ballpoint pen. She set the pen down. She looked at the first 2 letters of her name, already written in a crooked, distorted hand, and spoke softly to her dead mother, almost too quietly to be heard. "I don't understand, Mom. I did everything right. I never took anything from anyone, so how did it come to this?" She didn't cry. She simply sat there, both hands resting on the still warm lid of the washing machine, her eyes lowered to the tiled floor, and she remained that way for a very long time. The glass door swung open with the light chime of a bell. Junie Ballard walked in, her hair tied back in a hurry, a coat pulled over her nursing assistant's uniform, and 2 cups of coffee in her hands from the bakery that opened early at the end of the street. She had been searching for Delaney for 3 nights. She placed 1 cup on top of the washing machine, pushed it toward her, sat down in the plastic chair beside her, and looked at the form. She didn't say anything about it. She only took a small folded piece of paper from her coat pocket, laid it over the form, and said there was a place, an old doctor on Kestrel Street, a very poor place that paid almost nothing, but he never asked anyone about their history. Kestrel Street lay at the edge of the old industrial district, where the warehouses had been closed for years, and the rusted signs were left hanging because no one could be bothered to take them down. Delaney walked the final stretch because the bus route went only as far as the Palmer intersection, and she carried 1 cardboard box with her, leaving the other 2 at Junie's place. Number 12 was a single-story building wedged between 2 rows of brick walls. The glass front door had a crack running diagonally from the upper corner almost all the way to the ground, and someone had covered it with a wide strip of tape. The tape had been there a long time, because it had turned yellow and was peeling at both ends. A small wooden sign hung on the door, its hand-painted letters nearly all worn away, leaving only the word clinic and a few numbers still readable. The lights inside were still on, even though darkness had already fallen. Delaney stood on the sidewalk for a long while. She had stood before 6 doors in 6 days, and she had learned that the hardest distance to cross was always the final 3 steps. She set the cardboard box down, straightened her collar, and knocked. The man who opened the door was old, tall, and thin, with closely cropped silver hair and a white coat that had faded to the color of cream. The first thing Delaney noticed wasn't his face, but the hand resting on the doorknob. It was trembling, not badly, only a small, steady vibration, the kind anyone in her profession would recognize immediately and understand exactly what it meant. He looked at her. He looked at the nursing uniform that had been washed but not ironed, at the cardboard box by her feet, at the dark circles beneath her eyes that no makeup could hide anymore. She opened her mouth to say the words she had rehearsed on the bus, the words about having 7 years of experience and being willing to do anything, even mop floors, even wash instruments. But he stepped back and opened the door wider. "You're hungry," he said. "The rest can wait until tomorrow." Inside, the air smelled of rubbing alcohol and old paper. 2 rows of blue plastic chairs stood along the wall, beside a steel filing cabinet and a cloth curtain drawn across the room to divide it in 2. He led her through the curtain into a small kitchen in the back, lit the gas stove, and placed a dented aluminum pot over the flame. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't ask why a nurse with 7 years of experience was knocking on the door of a poor clinic at the edge of the industrial district after dark, with a cardboard box at her feet, and he didn't ask the question everyone else had asked, the question about what they had heard. He simply stood with his back to her, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, while the hand holding it trembled steadily with every circle. He set a bowl of noodles on the table in front of her, placed a spoon beside it, along with a paper napkin folded in half, then sat down in the chair across from her and opened a notebook. He pretended to write something, and Delaney understood that he was doing it so she could eat without having to endure anyone's eyes on her. She ate. She ate slowly for the first 3 spoonfuls, then faster. Then she had to stop halfway through and set the spoon down, wrapping both hands around the bowl for warmth because her throat had closed up and she didn't want the old man to see. He didn't look up. He turned a page in the notebook. When she finished, she rose to wash the bowl, but he told her to leave it. He led her to another small room farther in the back, where there was a folding bed and a desk lamp, a space that had probably once been used for storage, and he told her the blankets were in the cabinet and that she had to let the faucet run for a while before the water turned hot. Then he wished her good night, stepped out, and closed the door very softly behind him. Delaney sat on the edge of the folding bed in the darkness, her hands resting in her lap. Beyond the door, she could hear the old man washing the aluminum pot, the sound of running water, then footsteps passing outside, and then silence. She lay down without changing her clothes. She thought she would remain awake as she had every other night, thinking about the form still folded in her pocket, thinking about the 6 doors, thinking about the piece of cake with the most frosting that she had never come to claim. But she fell asleep before she could finish even one of those thoughts, and she slept without waking until daylight had fully filled the room, her first complete night of sleep in many days, something none of those 6 doors would ever be able to take from her again. Delaney had been working on Kestrel Street for 3 weeks when she began to count. She counted the number of people who came through the cracked glass door each day, counted the number who turned around and left when they saw every blue plastic chair already taken, and counted the number who never came at all, because they lived more than 2 miles away and had no transportation. That last number was the one she couldn't count, but she knew it was large. One late autumn afternoon, she waited until Barrow had finished his tea, then turned over an electricity bill, laid it on the table, and began to draw. She drew a rectangle to represent the old van sitting dead behind the clinic, the one he had kept because it had once belonged to someone whose name he didn't want to speak. She drew 3 circles for 3 stops: the parking lot of Bethel Church on the east side, the Ridley Street Market on Saturday mornings, and the patch of grass behind the abandoned textile mill on Holloway Street. Then she wrote down the numbers: the cost of repairing the van, the price of gasoline for 8 weeks, the minimum amount of supplies needed for 1 mobile clinic session. Beside those figures, she wrote another number, the number of people living within a 2-mile radius of each stop, and she drew a circle around it. Barrow studied the back of the bill for a long time. He said he was getting too old and couldn't drive anymore. She said she could. He said the van had been dead for 4 years. She said she had already spoken to the mechanic at the garage on the corner, and he had agreed to look at it for the cost of the parts. He said he didn't have money for additional supplies. She pointed to the last number on the paper, the average amount the congregation at Bethel Church donated at each gathering, according to the pastor. And then she sat quietly and waited. Barrow set down his cup, and the tremor in his hand made the saucer give a faint clink. He said all right. They would try it for 8 weeks. The van was running by the 2nd week of November. It was white, with a dent along one side that had never been repaired, and the rear door had to be pulled hard before it would close. Delaney personally taped 2 laminated paper signs to its sides, listing the name of the clinic, the 3 stops, and the hours. That winter was cold and damp, and they kept going through all of it. 11 people came to Bethel Church during the first week. By the 3rd week, there were 30. By the middle of December, the line at Ridley Market stretched past 3 stalls, and the vegetable seller at the first stall began setting out 2 stools for elderly people to sit on while they waited, without anyone having to ask. By February, the Kestrel Street Clinic and all 3 mobile stops together were seeing 300 people a week, compared with 40 people a week the previous autumn. Barrow stayed at the clinic receiving records and reviewing test results, while Delaney went out. Ridley Market was crowded and noisy every Saturday morning, filled with the smell of fish, the smell of fried dough, and the sound of people bargaining in 3 different languages. That morning, Delaney was checking the blood pressure of an elderly man, seated on a stool beside the van door when a cry rose from the bakery stall about 15 steps away. A young woman had just tasted a pastry with a nut filling, and now she was standing with one hand gripping the edge of the stall and the other clawing at the collar of her shirt. Delaney removed the blood pressure cuff and ran. She reached the woman in the space of 3 breaths, and what she saw was enough to make every question unnecessary. The woman's lips and the skin around her eyes were swelling rapidly. Her voice had already changed, and the wheezing in her breath had narrowed into a thin, high sound. Delaney called the condition by name, clearly and firmly, so that everyone nearby could hear it. Then she pointed to the nearest young man and told him to call emergency services immediately and repeat those exact 3 words over the phone. She pointed to a second person and told him to run to the end of the street and wait there to guide the ambulance in. She helped the woman sit down on the market floor with her back against the base of the stall, then asked whether she had anything in her bag. The woman shook her head. Delaney opened the pouch she wore at her waist, the one she carried everywhere and that Barrow had once laughed at for being too heavy, and took out the automatic injector she had bought with her own money that autumn and had never once needed to use. She told the woman to keep looking into her eyes, that she was going to inject the medication into the outside of her thigh, that it would sting a little, and that all she had to do was breathe with her. She administered the injection through the fabric of the woman's pants. She counted aloud. She placed a hand over the woman's wrist and kept it there, her eyes on her watch, while her voice continued in the same calm rhythm, talking about the weather, about how crowded the market was that day, about anything at all that might give the woman something to hold on to. The wheezing in her breath began to ease. The swelling around her eyes stopped spreading. The woman began to cry, and Delaney told her that crying was good, that being able to cry meant she was able to breathe. When the ambulance arrived, Delaney stood, gave the paramedics her report in their own precise medical language, brief, clear, without one unnecessary word, and they nodded and followed it. After the ambulance drove away, the entire market remained silent. Then the vegetable seller at the first stall clapped once, and the whole row of vendors and shoppers began to clap with her. Delaney only lifted one hand in a small wave before returning to the stool beside the van door, where the elderly man was still waiting for her to finish checking his blood pressure. The Ferraro estate stood at the end of a road lined with 2 rows of ancient oak trees, and every Sunday evening the family still ate together in the great dining room, because Rosalind Ferraro had preserved that custom since the days when her husband was alive, and no one dared to break it. That Sunday night, there were 4 people at the table. Rosalind at the head, Cassius to her right, Camille across from him, and Grayson Ashford at the far end, silent as always, eating little and drinking a great deal of water. The meal passed normally until Camille began telling a story. She told it the way people tell an amusing story at a party, with careful emphasis, pauses in all the right places, and her fork turning lightly through the air as she spoke. She told them about the gala, about a woman dressed as though she had just crawled out of a garbage cellar trying to walk straight through the main entrance, about how Camille had been forced to go out and stop her personally because the security guards were half asleep, and about how the woman had finally understood her place and left. Camille laughed at the end, then looked around the table, waiting for the others to laugh with her. Rosalind set her knife and fork down on the plate. The sound of metal touching porcelain rang clearly through the large room. She was an elderly woman who had been hospitalized twice that year, and her hand trembled whenever she held a glass. But when she spoke, the entire table fell silent. "You just said you pushed someone." Camille set down her fork, and her voice softened. "I didn't push anyone, Mother. I only stopped her." "Stopped whom?" "Some delivery woman. I didn't even know her face." Rosalind studied her for a long moment, then turned to look at her son. Cassius said nothing. He cut the meat on his plate, ate it, took a drink of water, and remained exactly that way until the meal was over. Grayson kept his face lowered toward his plate, and never looked up once. The servants brought out dessert, then carried it away again because no one touched it. When Rosalind rose and the chairs were drawn back, Cassius finally spoke. He said only one sentence, without looking at Camille, his eyes still resting on the tablecloth. "She was carrying my mother's medication. 4 vials. If even one had broken, my mother would have had to wait another 9 days for the next shipment." He stood and left the dining room. Camille remained seated alone with the fork in her hand and, for the first time in her life, the feeling that she had just lost something she hadn't yet learned how to name. In the hallway, Cassius stopped at the foot of the staircase and spoke to Ambrose Teague, who always stood 3 steps behind him wherever he went in that house. "The woman on the steps that night. Find out her name. Restore her to the exact position she had before, at the exact salary she had before, and repay everything she lost." Ambrose said yes. "And I don't want to hear about this again," Cassius said, then went upstairs. As far as he was concerned, the matter was finished. He had seen something wrong. He had given an order, and in all his life, not one of his orders had ever gone unfulfilled. He slept well that night. Ambrose passed the order down the next morning, through the foundation office, then to the executive board of St. Bellamy Hospital, and finally to the desk of Royce Hadley. 3 days later, the response traveled back up the same path, neat and complete with every required signature. Nurse Delaney Mercer had voluntarily submitted her resignation, had left her registered address, and according to information provided by former coworkers, had moved to another state. The file was closed. There was nothing left to restore. Ambrose held the paper in his hands and read it 3 times. He was 74 years old, and he had read far too many official documents in his life, not to recognize that a paper written too neatly was often a paper designed to end a matter, rather than report one. He said nothing to Cassius. He called an old acquaintance, a man who had once worked as an insurance investigator and now did the kind of work people didn't print on business cards, and asked him to look into a name. The man called back 4 days later. He said the young woman hadn't left the city. She was working at a poor clinic on Kestrel Street in the old industrial district. She was living there as well. Then he added that there was something strange. Her nursing license had been suspended because of an internal report, and that report had been prepared by the same man who had just signed the document claiming that she had gone away. Ambrose remained still for a very long time after ending the call. Then he did something he would think about, night after night, for many years afterward. He told the man to stop. He thanked him, paid him in full, and instructed him not to investigate anything else, not to question anyone further, and not to leave the slightest trace that someone was searching for the young woman. The man asked whether he was certain. Ambrose said he was. That night, after every light in the estate had gone dark, he leaned on his cane and descended into the basement, passed through the cold stone corridor, and entered the small room containing the old safe, whose combination had been known by only 2 people, one of whom had been beneath the ground for 6 years. He turned the lock, the steel door opened, and inside, resting on a faded piece of blue velvet, lay a large envelope sealed with red wax, the wax long hardened and split by a small crack along one edge. Ambrose placed his hand on the envelope. He left it there, his palm pressed against the thick paper, and closed his eyes. He thought about the name that had returned to his life after 7 years. He thought about the man in the mansion on the western hill, a man he knew better than anyone else in the city did. And he thought that if he opened that envelope now, when he possessed nothing but a name and an address, then within a week, someone would reach Kestrel Street before the police ever could. He withdrew his hand. He closed the steel door, turned the lock, and spoke softly to the empty room, to the dead man, and to himself. Not yet. If I open it now, she dies. Spring came late that year, and one afternoon near the end of March, Cassius Ferraro's car became trapped on Kestrel Street because workers were excavating a section of water pipe at the Palmer intersection, and the only available detour ran through the old industrial district. A fine rain was falling, the kind that wasn't heavy enough to keep the windshield wipers running continuously, but was just enough to blur the glass. The car moved forward a few yards, then stopped again. Cassius was reading a report on his lap when he looked up, turned toward the window on his right, and saw a line of people. They stood along the sidewalk outside a single-story building wedged between 2 brick walls, about 30 people in all. Some held umbrellas, some wore hoods, and some had nothing to protect them from the rain. An elderly woman sat on a stool someone had brought outside for her. 2 children stood beside their mother, laughing together about something while she held their hands. At the front of the line, beside the open door of a white van with an unrepaired dent along its side, a woman in blue nursing scrubs was kneeling on one knee on the wet sidewalk. An old man sat before her on the front step, barefoot, with the cuffs of his pants rolled up to his calves. She was washing and bandaging one of his feet. She worked slowly and carefully, without rushing, and as she worked, she kept talking to him, and he laughed. Then she looked up to say something to the next person in line, and for a moment her face turned toward the street beneath the thin rain and the gray afternoon light. Cassius recognized her. He didn't recognize her from the memory of her face, because that night he had been standing behind a pane of glass, 6 steps away. He recognized her by something else, by the way she worked without ever looking around to see whether anyone was watching her. His driver, a man named Whitlock, who had worked for the family for 11 years, glanced into the rearview mirror and asked whether his employer wanted to get out. Cassius watched for another moment. The woman finished cutting the bandage, gave the top of the old man's foot a gentle pat like a quiet blessing, then rose and helped the elderly woman from the stool into the building. "Keep going," he said. The car moved forward, turned left at the end of the street, and the building with tape covering the crack in its glass door receded behind them. Cassius didn't sleep that night. He sat on the top floor until very late with the lights off, and what kept him awake wasn't the image of her kneeling on the sidewalk, but a simple calculation he couldn't force from his mind. If that woman had been restored to her position the previous autumn, exactly as he had ordered, then she should have been wearing those scrubs inside a building with a roof and a heating system, not kneeling in the rain at the edge of the old industrial district. The next morning, he summoned Ambrose and told him to investigate a name: Delaney Mercer. Ambrose stood before him with both hands resting on the head of his black cane and said that he had already investigated her, sir, back in the autumn. Cassius asked what he had found, and Ambrose Teague, who had served 3 generations of masters in that family and had never spoken a single lie in 40 years, looked directly into the eyes of the young man seated behind the walnut desk and said there was nothing worth noting. He said she had resigned voluntarily, had found another position, and appeared to be doing well. Cassius nodded and asked nothing more. The old man bowed his head and left, limping down the hallway with the feeling that the cane in his hand was heavier than it had ever been before. 3 weeks later, trouble came to the East Harbor. 3 containers disappeared from dock number 7 in a single night. The paperwork remained intact, the seals remained intact, but everything inside them was gone. That same week, a Ferraro man working the night shift at dock number 2 was beaten in the parking lot and hospitalized. The investigation didn't take long. The name Merrick Doyle had spoken in the top-floor office on that rainy night had now taken on its complete shape. The Vasco family, a clan from the Southern Harbor District, was testing whether Salvatore Ferraro's 34-year-old son was softer than his father had been. People waited for a response. They waited for cars without license plates, telephone calls in the middle of the night, and men standing at the ends of dark streets. Nothing of the kind happened. Instead, Cassius Ferraro spent 3 days reading the Vasco family's financial records, and he found what he needed on page 21. Their entire transportation operation was insured by a small marine insurance company headquartered in Providence, a family business that had lasted for 3 generations and was now struggling for capital. He bought it. There were no long negotiations and no attempt to force down the price. He paid more than market value and completed the purchase in a single afternoon. The following night, the insurance policies covering the Vasco family's entire fleet and warehouse network were terminated in full accordance with their terms. Within 2 days, the Vasco family couldn't move a single ship out of port because no harbor would accept uninsured cargo, and no bank would release funds for an uninsured shipment. They called. Cassius accepted none of their calls. He said only one sentence to Ambrose when the old man asked whether they should leave the family a way out. "I don't need them to fear me. I need them to be unable to breathe without me." And in the Southern Harbor District, inside a damp office overlooking a container yard where everything had come to a standstill, the 3 Vasco brothers sat around a table and began calculating whether they would accept any job from anyone at all, as long as it paid in cash, and no one asked why. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the middle of spring, while Delaney was loading patient files into the van for the clinic session at Bethel Church. She heard a chair fall in the kitchen. Barrow was standing with one hand braced against the edge of the table and the other pressed to the center of his chest, his face fading to the gray color of ash, and he tried to tell her he was fine, but he couldn't finish the sentence. She helped him down to the floor, laid him flat on his back, called emergency services in the same voice she always used at Ridley Market, brief and clear, without one unnecessary word, then knelt beside him and held that trembling hand while they waited. He was still conscious when the ambulance arrived. He tried to smile at her. For the next 3 weeks, Delaney lived in the hallway of the cardiac ward at a public hospital on the east side. She slept in the plastic chair placed against the wall beside his bed, the kind of chair she had seen hundreds of times during her 7 years in nursing but had never once sat in herself. During the day, she continued running 2 mobile clinic sessions, because 300 people a week didn't simply disappear because one old man had fallen ill. And at night she returned, changed his water, washed his hands and face, and read the electrocardiogram results hanging at the head of his bed with the eyes of someone who understood the profession and knew better than anyone what those numbers were saying. Barrow slept often, but there were nights when he was awake, and on those nights he talked in broken pieces, one sentence failing to connect with the next, like a man turning through a photograph album without following the order of the pages. One night, he asked whether she knew the old Halloran Hospital, the 4-story building with the red tile roof that had been closed for 10 years. She said she did. Her mother had once been treated there. He was silent for a moment, then said he had worked there for 26 years, in general surgery, on the 3rd floor. Delaney sat very still. She asked whether he remembered a patient named Marion Mercer. Barrow stared at the ceiling for a long time, then said he remembered too many people, and now his memories no longer stayed where they belonged. Then he turned his head to look at her, and said that if the woman had been Delaney's mother, she must have been a very kind person. On another night, he told her about his hands. He said the trembling had begun when he was 61 years old, at first only in the mornings, then throughout the day, and he had managed to hide it for another 11 months by accepting only simple procedures. Then one afternoon, he set down his scalpel in the middle of an operation, called someone else in to replace him, walked home, and never entered an operating room again. He said the hardest part wasn't losing his profession. The hardest part was spending 30 years studying and working to earn those hands. And then one afternoon, they were simply gone. Delaney asked why he had opened the clinic on Kestrel Street, a place no one came to, a place that earned no money. Barrow closed his eyes and said it was because he still had his mind, and his mind didn't tremble. On the 18th night, he woke very late and called her name. He told her to sit closer. He said there was something he had wanted to tell her for a long time, that he had watched her all winter, watched her drive that van into the fog, watched her return after dark with both hands red from the cold, and he had thought about it a great deal. "I've done this work for 40 years, he said. "I've never seen anyone repaid for their kindness at the moment they needed it most. Not one person. But I've never seen a debt disappear completely either. It only goes around, Delaney. It travels a very long way for a very long time, and then one day, it comes home." Delaney told him not to talk so much. He laughed and said he had plenty of time. 3 days later, he was gone. On his final evening, he was strangely lucid, with the kind of clarity that everyone in the medical profession recognizes and fears. He told her to open the drawer of the bedside cabinet. Inside was a brown paper envelope. It contained a ring of 3 keys and a notarized document signed 2 months earlier, transferring ownership of the entire building at number 12 Kestrel Street, along with the van, to Delaney Mercer. She read the document twice and couldn't speak. She began shaking her head, and he reached out with his trembling hand and took hers to make her stop. "Don't," he said. "I have no one. I have a house with cracked glass and a broken van, and you're the only person in my life who ever made either of them useful." He gently tightened his hand around hers. "You're the child life never gave me." Delaney lowered her head to the edge of the bed. He left his hand inside hers for a very long time. Then he said, his voice much weaker now, that there was one more thing, that in the archive room beneath Halloran's basement, when they were clearing everything out before closing the hospital permanently, he had brought home several boxes of records because he couldn't bear to let them be destroyed. He said there was a metal box among them. He said he had found it several months earlier, and he had meant to give it to her. But he wanted to wait until she was a little stronger because he didn't think she could bear it yet. Delaney looked up and asked what box. Barrow opened his mouth. He managed to say 2 words, Halloran. Box. 2 words she would remember for days afterward, until she found what he had left behind, and then he stopped. His breathing changed rhythm. The machine beside him changed its sound. Delaney sprang to her feet, one hand already pressing the call button, her voice calling his name, but her other hand remained wrapped tightly around his and wouldn't let go, and she stayed that way until the staff came in, and until they stopped, and until the room became completely silent. She didn't know when morning came. They had to tell her twice that she could leave. She was still sitting in that plastic chair, holding the trembling hand that no longer trembled, and she remained there for a very long time, without crying, simply sitting, like someone waiting for another person to finish the sentence he had left behind. That summer, the name Kestrel Street began to be spoken in places where, before then, no one had even known where Kestrel Street was. A local newspaper ran half a page about the white van and its 3 stops. People retold the story from Ridley Market by word of mouth, and each time it was told, another detail that had never happened found its way into it. And at the estate, at the end of the road, lined with 2 rows of ancient oak trees, Rosalind Ferraro heard the story from her own housekeeper, whose younger sister lived on the east side. She asked for it to be repeated 3 times. Then, on a Friday afternoon, she ordered someone to call a car for her, not one belonging to the family, and she said nothing to her son. Her doctor had forbidden her to travel far. She was 71 years old. Her kidneys were functioning at only the lowest possible level, and every long journey had to be carefully calculated. She went anyway. She sat in the back seat with both hands resting on the head of her walnut cane, watching the city slowly change from glass facades to brick walls coated in dust. She wanted to see with her own eyes what a clinic with tape across its cracked glass door looked like, and why 300 people every week were willing to stand in line outside it. Her car was climbing the slope toward the Kestrel Street overpass when the rain began. The kind of summer rain that arrived within a minute and turned the road into a mirror. The tanker truck carrying industrial fuel behind her lost its brakes halfway up the incline. It didn't overturn. It slid sideways, crushed into the median, and everything behind it folded together in less time than a single breath. 6 cars in the right lane, 3 in the left, and a small truck carrying construction materials blocked the only way out. A utility pole at the bottom of the slope was pulled down, and the entire old industrial district fell into darkness at once. At number 12, Kestrel Street, Delaney was locking the door after the final clinic session of the day when the lights went out. She heard the endless blare of a car horn from the direction of the overpass, the kind of sound anyone who had ever worked in emergency care recognized immediately because it meant someone had collapsed over the steering wheel. She didn't stop to think. She turned back inside, grabbed 2 large supply bags, a flashlight, the plastic whistle hanging beside the door that Barrow had once used to call her in from the yard, and a box of chalk. Then she ran. The slope was nearly 300 yards long, and she ran the entire distance through the rain. What she found when she reached the top were 22 trapped passengers, 4 of whom had managed to scramble free from the wreckage and were now standing in the middle of the road without knowing what to do. There was no ambulance. There were no police. The only detour had been blocked by the accident itself. Delaney set the 2 supply bags down on the road, opened the box of chalk, and knelt to draw. She drew 3 large squares side by side on the wet pavement, the chalk catching only on the dry patch beneath a car, and in the 3 squares she wrote 3 words: red, yellow, green. Then she stood, blew 1 long blast on the whistle, and spoke loudly, very loudly, forcing her voice through the rain. She said anyone who could still walk was to move into the green square immediately. She said anyone already helping someone else was to raise a hand. 6 hands went up. She pointed to each person and gave each one a task, speaking in short sentences without a single, unnecessary word. You, take this flashlight, stand here, and shine it on my hands when I tell you. You, run to the bottom of the slope, stand at the intersection, and guide the ambulance up when it arrives. You, walk along the line of cars, open every door, count the people. Don't pull anyone out. Just count them, and come back to tell me. She moved along the line of vehicles in the opposite direction. She didn't spend more than 15 seconds with anyone. She touched a wrist, looked into a pair of eyes, asked 1 question, listened to 1 answer, then called out a single word, and whoever had been assigned to that square recorded the person there. Green, green, yellow, yellow, red, move to priority, bring them to the front. She worked at the speed of someone who had performed this sequence thousands of times in her mind, and had never before been forced to perform it in the real world. 3 people went into the red square. She returned to the first, pressed both hands over the bleeding and held them there, counting aloud, then guided the man holding the flashlight to place his hands exactly where hers had been and keep them there, without lifting them for any reason. She placed the second person on their side and assigned a woman to sit beside them, speak continuously, and report immediately if the sound of their breathing changed. The third was inside a black car in the left lane, in the back seat, with the door crushed inward. Delaney had to crawl in through the opposite side. An elderly woman sat there, 1 hand still gripping a walnut cane, her eyes open but unable to focus, her breathing shallow and fast. Delaney touched her wrist, and she understood at once what was happening, and she understood that it hadn't been caused by the collision alone. She pressed down to stop the bleeding in the woman's arm, placed her own coat beneath the woman's head, then leaned in very close, so that her face would remain within the narrow field of vision the woman still had, and she spoke. Look at me. As long as you're breathing, there's still time. The old woman, who had been slipping away, stopped. Her hand released the cane, rose, and closed around Delaney's wrist with a strength no one would have expected from a 71-year-old woman. She looked at Delaney. She looked very carefully, her vision blurred by the rain blowing through the broken window, and her lips moved. She had heard those words once before in her life, in an overcrowded emergency hallway 7 years earlier, when she had also been unable to see clearly and had also been counting every breath. She tried to speak. She tried to say one word, but the grip around Delaney's wrist loosened, her eyes closed, and she didn't wake again. The first ambulance reached the top of the slope after darkness had fully fallen, more than half an hour later. The paramedics saw 3 chalk squares drawn on the road, 22 people already sorted into their proper places, and a woman in soaked nursing scrubs kneeling on the pavement, both hands still pressing down, waiting for someone to come and take over for her. The story from the overpass appeared in the newspaper on Monday morning, taking up half a column on an inside page, accompanied by a photograph taken from a distance that showed the 3 chalk squares still faintly visible on the road after the rain had stopped. Delaney's name wasn't in the article. The writer referred to her only as a volunteer nurse from the old industrial district because she had refused to give her name when they asked. But at St. Bellamy Hospital, where people read the newspaper in the break room between shifts, no one needed a name to know who she was. Junie Ballard read the article 3 times, then cut it out, folded it, and placed it in her wallet. She was 24 years old, worked the afternoon shift as a nursing assistant, and for nearly a year, she had been the only person in that building who still spoke Delaney Mercer's name aloud, even when people told her she should stop. The man approached her on Thursday afternoon the following week, at the coffee shop across from the employee exit. He appeared to be around 40, wore a soft cloth coat, carried a crossbody bag, and stood to greet her as she walked past, calling her by her correct name. He said he wrote for a community health magazine in Boston and was working on a series about medical professionals who had been wrongfully suspended because of internal reports, and he said he had read the records from Delaney's case. He said it gently, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Junie sat down. He asked whether she believed her friend was innocent. She said she didn't believe it. She knew it. He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook. Then he said that a good article could accomplish more than 4 years in court, that the state nursing board was deeply afraid of public pressure, and that he had helped restore the licenses of 2 people that way before. Junie placed both hands on the table. For the first time in nearly a year, someone was telling her there was a door. She told him everything. She told him about the 6 doors that had closed in 6 days, about the landlady who had placed 3 cardboard boxes in the hallway, about the laundromat, and the form Delaney had almost signed. He was very good at listening. He nodded in the right places, remained silent in the right places, and only asked her to repeat something when she began speaking too quickly. Then he asked where Delaney was working now. Junie said the clinic at number 12 Kestrel Street in the old industrial district, the building with tape covering the crack in its glass door. He asked whether she lived there as well. Junie said yes, in the room at the back, and added that Delaney had been living there alone since Dr. Barrow died. He asked whether the clinic kept patients overnight. Junie said it did. 6 beds, all of them occupied by elderly people from the surrounding neighborhood who couldn't afford to go to a hospital, and the beds were always full. He asked which nights Junie worked there. She said Tuesdays and Fridays, and that Delaney was alone on the other nights. He wrote it down. He asked more questions about the rear entrance, about whether the front door was locked at night, and Junie answered every one of them. She even drew him a small map in the corner of the page so he wouldn't get lost when he came to take photographs. At the end of their conversation, he closed the notebook and thanked her. Junie asked when the article would be published. He said in about 3 weeks, perhaps sooner. She asked whether she should tell Delaney in advance. He thought for a moment, then said it would be better not to, because if the article wasn't approved, it would only give her friend false hope. Junie thought that made sense. He stood first, paid for both cups of coffee, and walked toward the door. Junie remained seated for a while longer, feeling lighter than she had felt in an entire year. She watched him through the window and saw him stop on the sidewalk, take out his phone, and call someone immediately, before he had even reached his car. She assumed he was calling the magazine office. Then she looked down at the notebook on the table and realized that during the entire hour they had spent together, she hadn't asked his name even once, and he had never given her a business card. That night, 6 elderly overnight patients were staying inside the clinic at number 12 Kestrel Street, ranging from 52 to 83 years old. Delaney was working alone because it was Wednesday. She made one final round past the 6 beds, adjusted the blanket over the elderly woman in bed number 2, wrote a note in the log, then sat down at the desk in the front room to finish the records for the weekend mobile clinic. She smelled it before she heard anything. The odor came from the back, from the storeroom where the files and medical supplies were kept. And in less time than a single breath, Delaney was already on her feet, already striking the alarm mounted on the wall, already running toward the 6 beds. She got 3 people out on the first trip. 2 of them could still walk, so she supported one on each side, while the third she half carried and half dragged. She lowered them onto the sidewalk across the street, told them not to get up, then turned and went back inside. On the second trip, she brought out 2 more. By then, the neighbors had filled the entire street. Some carried buckets of water, some were calling the fire department, and one man had taken off his coat and was beating it against the doorframe. The 6th patient, the 83-year-old man in the farthest bed, was the most difficult. Delaney went inside for the 3rd time, and she remained there longer than the first 2 trips combined. When she finally came out, 2 men had to rush forward and take the old man from her arms, and someone shouted at her to sit down. She lowered herself onto the edge of the sidewalk, breathing hard, both hands pressed against the concrete. She counted. She counted the 6 heads lying or sitting in scattered places along the opposite sidewalk. 6. Everyone. Then she looked up at the building, and she saw the left wall of the front room, directly above the steel filing cabinet, where a small wooden plaque hung. Barrow had carved it himself with a craft knife during the year he opened the clinic, carving it in the clumsy hand of a man accustomed to holding a scalpel rather than a carving blade, and on it were his name and the year he had begun practicing medicine. Delaney sprang to her feet and ran back inside. 3 people reached out to stop her, and none of them could hold her. Inside, it was dark and hot, and she moved by memory, 8 steps from the door to the filing cabinet. She had walked those 8 steps every day for more than a year. She tore the plaque from its 2 nails, clutched it against her chest, and ran back out. Someone dragged her through the doorway. At that exact moment, the rear section of the roof collapsed, and the sound silenced the entire street for one suspended instant. Delaney stepped into the middle of the road, made it 4 steps. Then her knees gave way beneath her. She knelt there on the pavement, both arms wrapped tightly around the wooden plaque, her face and hair covered in ash. And she cried. She cried aloud, unable to stop herself, unable to hide it, unable even to turn away. The entire street saw her. The woman who had never allowed anyone to see her cry through the 6 days of closed doors, through the night in the laundromat, through the 3 weeks on the plastic chair beside a hospital bed, through the morning they lowered Barrow's coffin into the ground. That woman knelt in the middle of the street and wept like a child, not because she had lost the building, but because that building was the only thing left of an old man who had called her the child life had never given him. Junie arrived just after the firefighters had put out the flames. She came running from the end of the street, still wearing her nursing assistant's uniform, and she saw the wreckage, saw the 6 people lying on the sidewalk, saw Delaney kneeling in the road with the wooden plaque in her arms. She stopped as though she had been struck. Then she walked forward, knelt beside her, and began to speak. She told her about the man in the coffee shop. She told her about the small notebook, about the series for the community health magazine, about the map she had drawn in the corner of the page so he wouldn't get lost. She said she had told him everything, including the work schedule, including the 6 beds. She said she had thought, that she had only wanted, that she had believed. Then she couldn't speak anymore. She collapsed onto the road beside Delaney and said she was sorry in the voice of someone who knew those 2 words were useless now. Delaney said nothing. She reached out one hand, still covered in ash, and placed it on Junie's shoulder. She left it there. That was all she did, and it was all that needed to be done. The black car arrived after the street had begun to empty, stopping about 20 yards away, and the man who stepped out came alone. Cassius Ferraro stood looking at the ruins for a long time. He looked at the 6 people on the sidewalk as blankets were wrapped around them. He looked at the white van, still untouched at the curb. And he looked at the woman sitting on the pavement with the wooden plaque resting across her lap. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He walked over, removed his suit jacket, and draped it around her shoulders. Delaney didn't look up. She didn't thank him. She didn't push the jacket away either. Cassius sat down on the edge of the sidewalk about an arm's length from her, both elbows resting on his knees, and he said nothing at all. His men stood at the far end of the street, and no one dared come closer. Junie sat silently on the steps behind them. The fire crews rolled up their hoses and left. Then the neighborhood gradually fell quiet, until only the sound of water dripping from the half-burned beams remained, and two people sat beside one another at the edge of the sidewalk in the smell of smoke, neither of them speaking a single word, until the sky beyond the old warehouses changed from black to gray, then to the palest shade of blue, and morning came. 3 days later, after barriers had been erected around the building, and the owner had been granted permission to enter and recover what remained, Delaney returned alone. She went in early that afternoon wearing a hat and cloth gloves, carrying a small shovel and 2 bags. No one came with her. She had told Junie to stay home, and Junie had understood that it wasn't a refusal. Inside, the place no longer held the shape of a clinic. All that remained of the cloth curtain that had divided the room was the steel rod, bent downward. The rows of blue plastic chairs had melted into hardened pools clinging to the floor. She worked slowly, moving from the front room toward the back, and she wasn't searching for anything in particular. She simply didn't want anyone else to do this for her. She found the steel filing cabinet still standing in its old place, twisted and blackened, and behind it, against the wall of the storeroom, were several cardboard boxes burned down to their bottoms, with stacks of paper fused together into solid blocks. That was where Barrow had kept the boxes of records he had brought home from the old Halloran hospital, the things he couldn't bear to let anyone destroy. Delaney knelt and began to dig. The metal box was at the very bottom, beneath a layer of paper pressed tightly together, and she recognized it immediately, not because she knew what it was supposed to look like, but because it was the only thing in the entire room that had kept its square shape. It was made of tin, about the size of a thick book, with all the paint burned away until only dull gray metal remained, and the lid was stuck. She sat down on the tiled floor amid the ruins and pried it open with the handle of the shovel. The inside was dry. Inside was a thin medical file, the paper yellowed with age but still intact, and on the cover, typed in clear letters, was the patient's name. Marion Mercer. Delaney sat without moving for a very long time. Then she removed her gloves, wiped both hands against the legs of her pants, and opened the file. She turned through the laboratory results, the nursing notes, the physician's orders. She read them with the eyes of someone trained in medicine, and through those eyes everything became clear with a cruelty that left no room for doubt. The disease had already spread before, not afterward. Before. Then she reached a document near the back of the file, a page with a bold printed heading and a signature in the upper right corner, a signature she recognized at once because she had seen it on birthday cards throughout the first 20 years of her life. A voluntary refusal of aggressive treatment, signed by the patient, notarized, and witnessed by 2 people. Delaney looked at the date written on the page, then looked again, then placed her finger over it and held it there as though she needed to make certain the number wouldn't change by itself. The date was 2 weeks before the evening, when she, a 20-year-old nursing student, had run from an overcrowded emergency hallway and withdrawn every dollar she had saved for her mother's treatment. 2 weeks before. Her mother had already signed that document. Tucked between the form and the final page was an unsealed white envelope with familiar slanting handwriting across the front. "For Laney, when you're ready." Delaney remembered it. Someone had given her that envelope at the admissions desk the week after the funeral, together with a bag of personal belongings, and she had taken it home, placed it on the table, and never opened it. She hadn't opened it for 7 years, because throughout those 7 years, she had lived with something she had never spoken aloud to anyone, that she had taken the money meant for her mother and given it to a stranger. And 3 months later, her mother had died, and she believed that if she opened the envelope, the question inside would be why. Then, during one move, the envelope had disappeared somewhere among her things. She had never looked for it. Now she held it in her hands, surrounded by the ashes of the building an old man had left to her, and she opened it. The letter filled only one side of the page. Her mother wrote that she knew. She wrote that she had known since the second scan, that the doctor had sat with her and spoken very kindly, and that she had signed the form because she didn't want the final 3 months of her life to pass through brightly lit hallways surrounded by tubes. She wrote that she had hidden it from her daughter because she knew her nature, knew she would argue, would borrow money, would work 3 shifts a day. Then she wrote that there was one thing she wanted to tell her, and she hoped Delaney would remember it longer than she remembered her. She wrote that money couldn't buy more time for her mother, but it could buy time for someone else, and that if Delaney ever found herself standing before a person she could still save, she mustn't stand there thinking about her mother. She had to go and save that person. Delaney read to the end. Then she read it again from the beginning. Then she lowered the page, placed it across her lap, and sat with her back straight on the blackened tile floor, both hands resting on either side of the letter, her eyes turned toward the window opening where the glass was gone, and the afternoon light entered in a pale golden strip across the room. She didn't cry. She had cried all she could 3 nights earlier. She only sat there for a very long time, in the absolute silence of a house that had burned itself empty, and allowed something she had carried on her back for 7 years to be set down, little by little, slowly, the way people lower a coffin they have carried too long and too far, though no one ever told them they had to carry it. It took Cassius Ferraro 9 days. He asked no one in the household for help, said nothing to Ambrose, and began where anyone who understood such matters would begin, with the personnel records of St. Bellamy Hospital, an asset of the Ferraro Foundation, where he had the authority to demand anything without explaining why. He ordered the complete access logs for the supply storage system during the quarter cited in the report. He ordered the entry card records for every employee. He ordered the original copy of the 11-page report and the scanned sample of Nurse Delaney Mercer's signature kept in her employment file from 7 years earlier. He didn't need a handwriting expert. He placed the 2 signatures beside each other on the walnut desk beneath the lamp and studied them for as long as it would have taken to finish an entire cigarette, had he been a man who smoked. The signature in the employment file flowed in a single, unbroken stroke, leaning toward the right, with the final letter stretching out and gradually thinning. The signature on the report had been written with the pen lifted 3 separate times, and its final stroke stopped too soon, as though the person writing it had been afraid of going too far. Then he examined the access logs. Throughout that entire quarter, Delaney Mercer's account hadn't opened the supply storage system during a single one of the night shifts cited in the report. For one simple reason, no one had bothered to verify. She didn't have access at that level, and she never had. The only person who had opened the system throughout that entire period, outside regular office hours and with an administrator's card, was Royce Hadley. Warehouse number 4 at the East Harbor hadn't held cargo for 2 years and was now used only to park forklifts. Hadley was brought there on Wednesday afternoon. No one touched him. No one spoke to him on the way. The car door was simply opened, and he stepped out, then walked across the wide concrete floor marked with faded yellow lines toward a folding table placed in the middle of the warehouse, where there were 2 chairs and a hanging lamp. Cassius was already seated there. He didn't rise. He placed a file on the table, opened it, and turned it around so Hadley could see. Then he pushed the second chair back slightly with the toe of his shoe, inviting him to sit. Hadley sat down. 2 signatures, Cassius said. His voice carried a faint echo through the empty warehouse. The access logs. And a document signed by you 3 weeks later, informing the Foundation office that this woman had resigned voluntarily and left the city. Hadley said nothing. I gave an order, Cassius said. You knew where that order came from, and you stopped it with a piece of paper. He waited for a moment, but not long. I don't care who you fear more than me. That's your private concern. I only care which document you sign first. He turned to the final 2 pages in the file and placed them side by side. On the left is a sworn statement. You'll write who called you, when they called, and what you received in return. On the right is the deed transferring the house on Prescott Street, the house where your wife lives, the house you mortgaged a second time last autumn to pay your daughter's first year of tuition. That second mortgage has belonged to me since Monday morning. He placed a pen between the 2 documents, exactly in the middle. They're both yours. You choose. Royce Hadley looked at the pen. He remained still for a very long time, both hands resting on his knees, while the only sound in the warehouse was the wind slipping through the gaps beneath the rolling door. Then he reached for the pen, pulled the page on the left toward himself, and began to write. He filled nearly 2 pages. His hand trembled so badly that he had to stop 3 times, and on the 3rd, he looked up and said he hadn't known it would go this far, that he had thought it was only a report, only paperwork. Cassius didn't answer. He waited until Hadley had finished, picked up the 2 pages, read them from beginning to end, folded them, slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, then stood and walked out without saying another word. That night, he returned to the estate. Camille was sitting in the small parlor with a magazine, and she looked up to greet him in the ordinary voice of an ordinary evening. Cassius didn't sit down. He placed the file on the glass table in front of her, opened it to the page where the 2 signatures appeared side by side, and stood there waiting for her to look. Camille looked. She looked for quite a while. Then she closed the magazine and said she didn't understand what he wanted. The engagement between our families, Cassius said, saved your father's company from bankruptcy. You know that. I know that. My father shook his hand and gave his word, and I will honor that promise, because honor is the only thing he left me that I can't buy with money. Camille began to say something. He didn't raise his voice, and she stopped. But you used my family's seal, he said, to take away a human being's means of survival, and you did it with a document bearing a forged signature. So from this day forward, you won't sign a single piece of paper bearing the Ferraro name. No contract, no authorization, no letter of recommendation, not one written line. You will carry my name. You will sit at the head of the table at every gathering. People will call you Mrs. Ferraro for the rest of your life. But that marriage will be nothing more than a ghost, and that will be all you ever have. For 3 weeks after the night on the overpass, Rosalind Ferraro lay on the 7th floor of a private hospital on the west side, in a room with windows overlooking the bay. While people took turns keeping watch beside her bed in shifts, Cassius came every evening. He sat in the chair on the right, saying nothing, sometimes reading documents, sometimes simply sitting there. The doctors said the kinds of things anyone who had ever worked in medicine understood were spoken when there was nothing certain left to say. Her kidney function had already been severely weakened, her body had endured a tremendous shock, and at her age, everything had become a matter of waiting. Then, on a weekend morning, while a nurse was wiping her face, Rosalind's eyelids moved. She opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling, then at the window, then at the nurse, and her gaze didn't drift away. It settled exactly where it meant to, and that nurse would later say she dropped the cloth onto the floor. Someone called Cassius. He arrived in less than 20 minutes, still wearing his shirt without a tie, and entered the room with Ambrose Teague, who had followed him on his cane all the way from the parking lot and hadn't yet caught his breath. Cassius bent over his mother's bed. Rosalind looked at her son. She tried to raise one hand but couldn't, so he took it in his. Her lips moved. She tried 3 times to gather enough breath to make a sound, and then she spoke. She said 3 words. "It's that girl." Cassius leaned closer and asked what she had said. She repeated it, a little more clearly, and it was still those same 3 words. The doctor, standing at the foot of the bed, wrote something on the chart and explained, in the practiced voice of someone accustomed to explaining such things, that patients emerging from a prolonged coma often spoke in disconnected fragments during the first few days, that it might be nothing more than a remnant of a dream, and that he shouldn't try to find meaning in it. Cassius asked his mother which girl she meant. Rosalind looked at him, and in her eyes was an urgency he had never once seen in his mother throughout all 34 years of his life. But she couldn't say another word. Her eyelids grew heavy. She fell asleep again. Cassius straightened and remained there for a long moment, then told the doctor he wanted to know exactly what medications were being administered and every hourly reading, and he stepped into the hallway to make a call. Ambrose Teague didn't follow him. He remained standing at the foot of the bed, both hands resting on the head of his black cane, and no one noticed when all the blood drained from his face. He didn't hear the doctor speaking. He didn't hear the door open. He heard only those 3 words repeating again and again inside his mind, and he remembered an overcrowded emergency hallway in a public hospital on a night 7 years earlier. He remembered exactly where he had been standing in that hallway, remembered what he had been holding in his hands, and remembered how he had run away. For 7 years, he had told himself that Rosalind hadn't seen anything, that her vision had been blurred, that she had been slipping into unconsciousness, that the room had been dark and crowded and chaotic. He had survived those 7 years by holding on to that belief. Now he stood at the foot of her bed and understood that she had remembered something, and he didn't know which part she had remembered, and he also understood that he no longer had time to wait and discover what she might say next. He returned to the estate before Cassius. He didn't remove his coat. He went straight through the entrance hall, down the servants' staircase, through the cold stone corridor beneath the house, moving faster than he had moved in years, his black cane striking the floor in a hurried, uneven rhythm. The small room at the end of the corridor, the old safe. He turned the lock with fingers that had begun to tremble, and he had to start again once because he missed one of the numbers. The steel door opened. The large envelope was still lying on the faded blue velvet, its red wax hardened and split by a small crack along one edge, exactly as it had lain there for 7 years. Ambrose took it out. He didn't stop to think. He didn't speak to the dead man, didn't speak to himself, didn't speak to the empty room. He tucked the cane beneath his elbow, held the envelope in both hands, slid his thumb beneath the paper where the wax had cracked, and broke the seal. Inside the envelope were 3 things: a 4-page handwritten letter in the square, careful script of a man who had learned to write in a church school, a bundle of copied bank records fastened together with a staple, and a final sheet smaller than all the others, written in greater haste, containing only 4 lines. Ambrose Teague sat down on the only wooden chair in the basement room and read beneath the sickly yellow ceiling light. And he read from beginning to end without stopping once. Salvatore Ferraro had written the letter during the final winter of his life, 1 year before his death. And he began by saying that if someone was reading these words, then the time had come, and that whoever was reading should sit down before continuing. He wrote that in the autumn 7 years earlier, the Ferraro family had been in the middle of negotiations over the operating rights to the East Harbor, and on the other side of the table sat Ashford Holdings, represented by Silvano Ashford. He wrote that he had refused 3 times. He wrote that after the 3rd refusal, his wife became ill. Then he wrote the part he had been forced to rewrite several times, because the original contained 3 passages that had been crossed out and written over. He wrote that what happened to Rosalind that night wasn't an illness, nor was it an accident of the body. He wrote that someone had replaced the thing that was supposed to save her, and had done it inside his own home, with the hands of someone he trusted. He wrote that it had taken him nearly 2 years to trace the truth, and that the enclosed records showed 3 payments from an intermediary company belonging to Ashford Holdings, and that the recipient wasn't some unknown stranger. He wrote the name on the 11th line of the 2nd page, Ambrose Teague. He continued by saying that he understood why. That decades ago, when Ambrose was still in his youth and had only recently entered the family's service, something had happened at dock number 3, something that had never reached a courtroom and for which no one had ever been questioned, something known by only 3 men, 2 of whom were now dead. Silvano Ashford was the 3rd. Salvatore wrote that he wouldn't describe that event in the letter because it no longer mattered, but he wanted the reader to understand that there were ropes a man allowed to be tied around his neck in his early years, then carried for the rest of his life without ever daring to turn around, and that the man who had held that rope for 40 years had never pulled it until that autumn. Then Salvatore wrote the final part, and he wrote it slowly, because the handwriting there became larger and more widely spaced. He wrote that he had reconstructed the entire night, step by step, and that the other man had done what he had been paid to do, but had stopped halfway through. No one had forced him to stop. No one had seen him. He had been alone in that room with a sleeping woman, and he had stopped, and he had fled from the house in the night, and he hadn't warned anyone, hadn't called for help, hadn't spoken a word, but had simply run. Salvatore wrote that it was because he had stopped halfway through that Rosalind had still been taken to the hospital in time, and he wrote that at the hospital that night, in an overcrowded emergency hallway where no one had any space left and no one had any time, a 20-year-old nursing student had done things no one had asked her to do, and no one had paid her to do. He wrote that his wife had survived because of 2 people, one who had stopped halfway through, and one who hadn't stopped at all. When Ambrose reached that line, he had to lower the page onto his lap. He sat motionless for a very long time, in the cold room beneath the earth, both hands resting on his knees, and he thought about 40 years of service, thought about how people still called him the most loyal man the family had ever known, thought about how he had stood 3 steps behind Cassius everywhere in that house for the past 6 years. Then he lifted the letter and finished reading. Salvatore wrote that he had chosen not to accuse him. He wrote that if he had exposed the truth at the time, Silvano Ashford would have denied everything. The only person left to bear the blame would have been the man who had stopped halfway through, and the young nursing student would have become the sole witness in a case where the other side possessed enough money to make a witness disappear. He wrote that he had chosen another way. He had created a foundation bearing 2 initials instead of a full name, hidden that woman behind those 2 letters, and kept this envelope so that one day, when the balance of power had changed, whoever read it would hold everything needed without paying for it with another human life. And on the final line, Salvatore Ferraro wrote a single sentence meant only for the man he believed would eventually open the envelope. He wrote that he could have cast him out long ago, but had kept him close because a man who had stopped halfway through once would stop again, and because he believed the day would come when that man would walk to the place he needed to reach without anyone leading him there. Ambrose Teague folded the 4 pages along their original creases. He stood, leaned on his cane, climbed out of the basement, and went directly to the top-floor office, where Cassius had just returned and was removing his coat. He didn't knock, because he was the only person in the building who didn't have to, and this was the final time he would use that privilege. He approached the desk. He placed the 4-page letter and the bundle of financial records on the walnut surface beneath the lamp. Then he set both hands on the edge of the desk, bowed his head, and spoke. "Sir, I've come to surrender myself." The Ferraro Foundation's conference room was on the 22nd floor, a long room with a dark wooden table and 14 chairs. Though that day only 7 people were present, Cassius sat at the head of the table. Camille and Grayson Ashford sat on the left. On the right were 2 foundation attorneys and a notary. Rosalind Ferraro was brought in by wheelchair and placed at the opposite end of the table, a blanket covering her knees, and she had demanded to be present in the kind of voice no one in the family dared challenge. Delaney Mercer sat some distance from the table in a chair placed against the wall because she had refused to sit with them. She wore the only thin cloth coat she still owned that remained intact, both hands resting in her lap, and throughout the entire meeting she didn't say a single word. Ambrose Teague stood. He didn't sit. He placed the 4-page letter and the bundle of financial records on the table before the notary, then began by reading Salvatore Ferraro's statement of final wishes aloud exactly as it had been written, from the first line to the last, without omitting a word, including the passages that spoke about him. His voice remained steady and clear for most of it, faltering only once, at the part describing that night. When he finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then Ambrose turned to the 3rd sheet, the smallest one, containing only 4 lines, and said there was one more thing that only he, among the living, still knew, and that it was time to reveal it. He said the treatment unit at St. Bellamy Hospital, the unit whose records, signs, and staffing schedules had all carried the initials M.M. for the past 6 years, wasn't named for a medical term, as most employees had assumed. He said Salvatore Ferraro had personally ordered that only those 2 initials be carved into the wall, and had rejected the board's proposal 3 times to display the full name for the sake of formality, because writing the full name would have shown the way to anyone still searching. Then he read the name aloud, Marion Mercer. He said that was the name the 20-year-old nursing student had signed on the blood donation form that night, because she didn't yet hold a professional license and wasn't permitted to sign her own name, so she had signed her mother's instead. He said the Ferraro family had searched for Marion Mercer for 7 years and had found only a death certificate dated 3 months after that night, and so they had believed their benefactor was dead and had carved those 2 initials into the wall, as though carving them onto a grave marker. He stopped. He turned his head toward the chair against the wall. He said the woman who had signed that name was Marion Mercer's own daughter, and that for the past 2 years she had worked night shifts beneath those initials, pushed medication carts past that sign every day, and been driven out of the very building that bore her mother's name. Someone in the room drew in a sharp breath. It was Rosalind. She raised both hands to cover her mouth and looked toward the chair against the wall, and she didn't take her eyes away from it again for the rest of the meeting. Delaney remained still. She didn't move, didn't lower her head, didn't raise a hand to her face. She only stared straight ahead, while the hands resting in her lap clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and that was all anyone could see. Camille Ashford was the first to speak. She said the events from 7 years earlier had nothing to do with her, that she hadn't even known the Ferraro family at the time, and at first her voice remained perfectly steady. One of the foundation attorneys pushed the bank records toward her. She opened them. She looked at the 3 payments, and at the name of the intermediary company in the left-hand column. And she read that name a second time, then a third. It was the company whose board she had served on since she was 23 years old. It was the company her father had established while she was still in high school. Cassius spoke only 1 sentence during that entire portion of the meeting. He said the insurance investigators had concluded the previous week that the fire on Kestrel Street hadn't been an accident, and that the money paid to the people who carried it out had come from that same intermediary company, from the same account, 7 years apart. Camille couldn't speak again. She sank lower into her chair, the file slipping from her hands, and she remained that way with her eyes open, staring at some point on the surface of the table, and everyone understood that in that moment she wasn't thinking about the engagement or the company, but about the man who had taught her to ride a horse when she was 7 years old. Grayson Ashford stood. He rose, even though no one had asked him anything, and he said, his voice trembling but never stopping, that over the past 3 years he had created 7 fraudulent consulting contracts with the Ferraro Foundation and withdrawn an amount of money whose exact figure he would write down immediately. He said he had done it because of gambling, that no one was forcing him to confess, and that he was confessing because he had sat silently in that room for 3 years and didn't want to remain silent for one more afternoon. Then he sat down and looked at his hands. The last person to speak was Rosalind Ferraro. She asked to be wheeled closer to the table. She said she knew how much time she had left, that the doctors had explained it in the kind of language she had learned how to hear, and that she had no intention of spending that time resting. She said she would testify fully and under oath against Silvano Ashford, and that she would do it as soon as possible because she wasn't certain she would live long enough to wait. The two attorneys began talking about the risks, about how she was the only surviving witness, about what kind of position that would place her in. Rosalind interrupted them. She spoke slowly, and she spoke while still looking toward the chair against the wall. I lived 7 more years because of someone whose face I couldn't even see clearly. Those 7 years were borrowed. Now I'm giving them back. The meeting ended after darkness had fallen. Rosalind was wheeled out first, followed by the attorneys carrying their files. Camille was helped away by members of her family through the private elevator, while Grayson remained seated alone at the far end of the table for a long time before finally rising. Delaney was still sitting in the chair against the wall. Cassius stood by the window with his back to the room, looking down at the city as its lights came on, and only when the two of them were alone did he speak. He asked her a single question, and he asked it not in the voice of a man conducting an interrogation, but in the voice of someone who had held that question in his hands all afternoon and hadn't dared open it. He asked why she had never told anyone during all those 7 years. Delaney remained silent for a moment. Then she said she had known. She said that night, in the emergency hallway, when she helped the woman lie down and slipped a hand beneath her head to support it, she had seen the patient identification bracelet around her wrist, and printed on it was a name everyone in the city knew. She said she had read it, then continued working, and hadn't thought about it again until everything was over and she went outside to sit on the fire escape steps with both hands still trembling. Cassius turned around. He asked what happened then. Delaney said that 3 weeks later, she had gone there. She said she had taken 2 buses and walked the final distance. And on a Thursday afternoon, she had stood in the lobby of the Ferraro building wearing the finest coat she owned, holding an envelope containing her mother's hospital bill. She said she had stood there for a long time, looking at the stone reception desk, looking at the 2 security guards, watching people pass back and forth, and rehearsing her opening words in her mind at least 10 times. Then she said she hadn't stepped forward. Cassius asked why. Delaney looked down at her hands. She said that as she stood there, she suddenly thought about the moment when she had handed over the money at the pharmacy counter, and she realized that at the time, she hadn't once thought about being repaid. She said that if she walked to the reception desk now and gave them her name, that moment would change its meaning. It would no longer be something she had done. It would become an investment she had come to collect. She said that kindness demanded back was no longer kindness. It was only a bill submitted late. She said she had turned toward the door and walked home, and she had walked the entire distance because she had spent the last of her bus fare. 3 months later, her mother died. Cassius said nothing. He pulled a chair away from the conference table, placed it 2 steps from her, and sat down, sitting slightly lower than she did because the chair against the wall was higher. Then he asked the second question, the one he hadn't been able to ask all afternoon, about the night on the steps. He said that night, all she had needed to do was speak 1 sentence. All she had needed to do was say her name and tell them what she had done 7 years earlier, and everything would have ended right there, on those steps, in front of 200 people. He said there would have been no 6 closed doors, no 3 cardboard boxes in the hallway, no Kestrel Street, no fire. He asked why she hadn't spoken. Delaney raised her eyes and looked at him. What would I have received by telling them? She said. A debt repaid. They would have apologized, returned my job, handed me an envelope, and told me to forget the whole thing. She continued, her voice no louder, no less steady, but my mother would still be dead. After 7 years, she would still be dead. No debt of gratitude could change that, and from that day forward, I would always be the woman who traded her mother's death for a place to stand. Cassius lowered his head. He remained that way for a long time, both elbows resting on his knees, while the only sound in the room was the steady hum of the air conditioning somewhere above them. Then he spoke, and his voice was very quiet. He said that he had stood 6 steps away from her that night, that he had seen everything, and that he had turned away. He said that afterward, he had given an order, and he had slept soundly for nearly a year, because he believed giving an order was enough. He said that now he understood that power without checking what became of it was nothing more than indifference with a signature added. The Foundation's chief attorney returned to the conference room with the final set of documents. He explained that under the terms established by Salvatore Ferraro, the share reserved for the benefactor or the benefactor's lawful heir amounted to 20% of the Ferraro Foundation's value, that it had been placed into an irrevocable trust 6 years earlier, and that all he required was one signature. Delaney listened to everything. Then she said she wouldn't accept it. The attorney began explaining that legally, refusal wasn't that simple, and Cassius raised a hand for him to stop. He asked her what she wanted. Delaney stood. She said she wanted one thing. She said that on the 4th floor of St. Bellamy Hospital, on the wall opposite the elevators, there was a brass plaque engraved with 2 initials. She said she had walked past it for 2 years, on every shift, twice each time, once going in and once coming out. She said she wanted them to remove that plaque and engrave it again in full, with no initials, so that anyone passing by could read it. Then she spoke her mother's name. 1 summer had passed since that afternoon in the conference room on the 22nd floor. The brass plaque on the wall opposite the 4th floor elevators at St. Bellamy Hospital had been removed and engraved again, and now it bore a full name in large letters, with no initials, so that anyone passing by could read it: the Marion Mercer Treatment Unit. Beneath the name was a smaller line stating that the unit accepted patients without insurance, and those words weren't there for decoration, because every morning the waiting room seats were filled before the doors even opened. Delaney Mercer was the head of the unit. She still wore blue nursing scrubs and medical shoes. The only difference was that the soles of her shoes were whole now. The white van with the unrepaired dent still traveled to its 3 weekend stops, and a small new line had been added to its side, bearing the name of an old doctor who had carved a wooden plaque with a craft knife. That plaque hung beside the entrance to the treatment unit, and the corner scorched by the fire had been left untouched and unpainted. On Tuesday morning that week, a man in a white shirt without a tie entered the waiting room, walked to the number dispenser in the corner, and pressed the button. Number 41. He looked around, saw that every seat was taken, then walked over to the wall beside the window and leaned against it. An elderly woman in the first chair turned to study him for a moment, then shifted aside to make room. He thanked her and sat down. Cassius Ferraro waited in that room for nearly an hour. In all his years, he had never once been required to wait his turn anywhere. The previous autumn, he had handed Delaney a check. She had taken it, looked at the amount, torn it in half in front of him, and said that if he wanted to make amends, he could roll up his sleeves. But if he wanted to purchase peace of mind, the door was behind him. From that day forward, he stopped offering money. He offered other things instead: permits, a long-term lease at a symbolic price, and 3 appearances before the state medical board. The man seated at the reception desk was Grayson Ashford. He volunteered 4 shifts a week, wore a shirt printed with the name of the treatment unit, and helped people complete forms and find the laboratory. He had repaid every dollar, signed an agreement with investigators, and chosen this work himself when no one had asked him to do anything at all. On his first morning, he told Delaney that it was the first decision he had ever made entirely for himself. Camille Ashford left the city during the winter, after the first trial involving her father. 1 year later, the treatment unit office received a check with no sender's name, accompanied by a handwritten note containing only 1 line. It said that she still didn't know how to apologize, but she had learned how not to turn away. When number 41 was called, the examination room door opened, and Delaney stepped out. Cassius rose. They looked at one another across the crowded room. She gave him a single nod, and he went inside. That afternoon, after the flow of patients had begun to thin, the sound of running footsteps came from the hallway. An 8-year-old boy burst through the door, his hair disheveled and the laces on his sneakers tied unevenly, and he ran straight into Delaney's arms before she could turn around. Toby was nearly a full head taller than before. He told her she was 1 year late, that the piece of cake with the most frosting she had promised to claim had eventually been eaten by his grandmother, and that this year his birthday would be held in his grandmother's backyard again, and she had to come. She wasn't allowed to miss it this time. Delaney bent down and wrapped her arms around him, and she laughed. She truly laughed, aloud, throwing her head back. And the people standing nearby turned to look, because in 2 years of working in that building, no one had ever heard her laugh that way. Toby took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from his backpack and taped it to the wall beside the door, directly beneath the scorched wooden plaque. The new drawing showed a house, a white van, and a great many people standing in line, all of them smiling. Ambrose Teague wasn't there. He was serving the sentence he had stepped forward to accept, and once every month, a letter arrived at the treatment unit, written in the square, careful handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a church school. Every letter was brief. Everyone asked about Rosalind's health, asked about the van, and ended with the same sentence, that he had once stopped too late, and he hoped Delaney would never have to understand what that felt like. This story leaves us with something very simple. Kindness doesn't need to be witnessed in order to have value. A good deed done in darkness, seen by no one and praised by no one, is still a good deed, and it can travel a very long way before one day finding its way home. But something else is equally true. Silence always carries a price when we watch another human being crushed. 200 people stood behind the glass that night, and not one opened the door. The man standing 6 steps away turned his back, and every one of them eventually paid that price in a different way. Don't be the person standing behind the glass. Sometimes all it takes is one person stepping outside to change an entire life. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with anyone you believe needs to hear it, so that we can continue walking together through many compelling stories every day. How did Delaney's story make you feel? If you had been standing behind the glass that night, would you have stepped outside? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video lasting health, happiness, peace, and serenity in your daily life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.